Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Linda Weissgold on the business of intelligence from Reagan to Biden. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. Today we have with us Linda Weissgold, who was CIA's Deputy Director for Analysis from March 2020 until April 2023. In that role, she was responsible for the quality of all source intelligence analysis at the CIA and for the professional development of the officers who produced it. During her 37-year career at CIA, Linda was part of the creation and delivery of intelligence analysis on a variety of complex issues and in multiple settings. Before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, she was an analyst and leader of analytic programs focused on the Middle East. Immediately afterward, she was among those that volunteered for counterterrorism assignments. The units she guided, including as the head of the CIA's Office of Terrorism Analysis, generated insights that informed U.S. policy and operations across multiple administrations and helped to identify Osama Bin Laden's location and the rise of ISIS. For more than 2 years, she also served as President George W. Bush's intelligence briefer. Welcome, Linda. Thank you for being with us in the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also, congratulations on your great career. That's one of the things we'd like to talk about and how we identified our title from Reagan to Biden. So if you could tell us about some of the dramatic changes you saw since you joined the agency in the 1980s.
Sure, my pleasure. You know, every time someone talks about 37 years, I start to feel a little old there. But it also, I think, is a testament to the fact that it's not unusual to have folks who have had long careers at the agency. I think it's a testament to the agency and the exciting nature of the work. So you're right. When I joined CIA, the Berlin Wall was still up. We were still in, if you will, the kind of final throes of Cold War, from a period in time in which we moved from that to 9/11 and the global war on terrorism and a reorientation, as you mentioned, in my own career. I moved from having worked the first 15 years of my career on the Middle East to then working on terrorism issues. From that, I think, if you look at it we're a little bit coming full circle as we move back into the great power competition. And it is something that our analysts have to look at differently. We had gone through such a long period of time with a high focus on the global war on terror, and it's not something that we can stop looking at. But I do think we are taking a more strategic look sometimes now instead of perhaps more tactical look on some issues. I think the other things, that changed were, as you talked about in the title for this podcast, the business, the way we do some of our work. The fundamentals of being an analyst didn't change in 37 years, but the tools, the techniques, the interactions with customers, all of that did evolve and change. And I hope we're going to get a chance to talk a little bit about that. When you retire, you get an opportunity to look back through your own performance appraisals. And I was really struck by the idea when I was looking through them that at one point I was praised for being an early adopter of the internet as for research. And nothing will make you, the only thing that made me feel older than that was at one point in CIA's museum where the old computers that I swore was mine was actually in the museum. That made me feel kind of old as well. So, a lot of change happened during my career, but a lot of change is going to continue to happen. I was asked not too long ago if we were in the most dangerous time ever. And I responded that no, I don't think it's this the most dangerous time. We're not in World War III. But I do think that every person who ever held my job running the analysis for CIA has at some point in their tenure has said that it's the most complex time ever. I say it now because I think that the international order that was set up after World War II and the organizations that were set up as part of that are really struggling to meet the demands of today, let alone tomorrow. I think the rise of China as a competitor, the decline in many ways of Russia, they're not going down without a fight. And I think Ukraine shows that. I think it's leading to a lot of other players trying to form new alliances, new partnerships. Just look at how many countries tried to apply to be part of the BRICS in the past year or two. It was huge. And then finally, just the rise of technology and the changes that are occurring as a result of that. Throw in things like, I don't know, a little bit of climate change, a little bit of pandemics and all kinds of other stuff. And I would say it's probably one of the most complex times. So even though I went through a lot in my time, a lot's going to change in the future as well.
Let's you were focused on the Middle East in your career, and that obviously was all that was never a sleepy location. It was never a location where policymakers didn't have it, at least on the front burner, I would say. But how did you see that changing? And then when did you start to perceive that terrorism was going to become more of an issue for us down the road? Because we didn't, I mean, we're talking, obviously you were working the issue many years before 9/11.
Right. So, you're right. It was never a sleepy issue. It was also an intractable issue, which was jokingly job security. For those of us who followed the Middle East, you always kept hoping that it was going to get better. But yet then you would see something happen like Arafat turning down probably one of the best offers he was ever going to get because he didn't want to be the one to really sign off on the end of the Palestinian dream.
In 2000.
In 2000, exactly. Right. So again, you kept seeing this happen over and over again. But terrorism was really already prevalent when I joined the agency in the mid-'80s. My very first account I worked on was Lebanon. And while we had the civil war raging, we also had hostages in Lebanon. And so it wasn't that I was somehow prescient in saying terrorism was going to be a big thing. It was already happening. So that's part of the reason why when 9/11 happened, many of us who had been working that region moved over to help, along with folks from throughout the agency. But we had already been looking at the phenomena of terrorism for quite some time.
But
as a matter of fact, the counterterrorism center at CIA was started about a year before I joined the agency. So the agency had already moved to get something that is another part of those changes that occurred during my 37-year career. That moved towards a center construct where you had analysts and operators working together. That really mirrors. So John Brennan went to that for the entire agency, and I believe it was 2015 or so. But it had started in many ways with the Counterterrorism Center in the mid-'80s. So that was something that we, already realized that having that synergy between analysts and operators really did help to accelerate our knowledge and our operations.
When was your first experience working in a center?
Working in a center?
Yes.
So let me see. I think directly my first experience was 9/11, but as I said, right after 9/11, I went to Counterterrorism Center. But I had worked very closely with them throughout the beginning of my career. And then I came into the agency through a program that doesn't exist now, but it was called the Career Trainee Program. And you came in, folks from all the different directorates at CIA came in, and for a year, we would work together we would train together, and we did rotational opportunities throughout the agency. So I had spent several rotations working in the Directorate of Operations. So now I am hoping you are still there, because I've gone to just a little screen, and I've lost my picture of you, Michael.
We lost Michael temporarily, and he's just rejoining us now.
Oh, good. Okay.
Sorry, I lost connectivity. Sorry.
There you go. So as I was saying that, I joined the as a CT and worked with the Directorate of Operations quite closely, and worked in the Directorate of Operations. But my first real work in a counterterrorism center was right after 9/11.
What was the difference in, working because I never worked in a center in my career, but I imagine the biggest change was your ability to work with the Director of Operations on a day-to-day basis.
So absolutely, no matter what account you were on, even if you weren't in a center, I always thought the best analysts had close relations with their operational counterparts. The difference, though, being in a center, I would say, would be two things. One, analysts had much greater access to operational traffic. Mm-hmm. Now, that's something that occurs more widely now than back then. But so analysts in the Counterterrorism Center had access to being able to see more information about sourcing. And that's important, because fundamentally, to me, an analyst job, an analyst tradecraft, is about being able to explain why you think what you think. And that means it's about you have to be able to understand your sourcing. So when sourcing is masked, like it usually is, you sometimes don't know whether this is two reports from the same guy. Is this circular reporting? And the more information you know about the sourcing, the better. So I would say that would be one of the big differences. The other would be that you started to really see the Director of Operations also as a customer, more so than just policymakers. And so I think that those two things were key to what was different about working in a center. So, and I see we lost Michael again.
I'm back.
There you are.
Yeah, sorry, folks. It's just a little bit of we had some storms down here, and I think our internet's been a little shaky since then.
Okay.
But yeah, so we'll deal with it. Peter, jump in if we need to. Linda, what you had an opportunity now to observe this, and now that it's been nearly I guess 9 years in operation in the centers throughout, has the cultures changed of the former directorates based on this arrangement? How do they maintain their unique identities?
So, that was a concern when we went to a center construct. In particular, Congress and others rightfully questioned about the analysts maintaining their objectivity as a result of being in a center construct. And so we were very careful when we created it, with the idea to say that analytic work is being reviewed by analysts, and so the chain of review is analyst only. The chain of review for promotion is done by the directorate rather than by the mission center. So again, that reward structure is tried to have been kept in a way that keeps it more objective. I think, though, that the things that were really good about it, as I mentioned, as part of the Counterterrorism Center, analysts had much greater access to operational information. That's happening today in the Mission Center construct throughout the agency, and I think that's helpful. But what you really just have to keep in mind is that, the analysts make the analytic calls and the operations officers make the operational calls. And so I always said to the analysts, why wouldn't you want input from the Directorate of Operations? We would pay good money in the past for someone who spoke the language, has been in the region, knows the people, those kinds of things. So getting their input on and thoughts on things is important, but that doesn't mean you have to accept what they say. And the same thing for the Directorate of Operations, that you have, they may say, what do you think about this operation? An analyst may say, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. They still may do it, right? Because fundamentally, I think operations officers are an optimistic bunch. You have to be to say, you know what, I'm going to get someone to commit espionage by, or, um, with a cold call on something, right? You have to be somewhat optimistic. But they were searching, and seeking out our views. I think some of the changes that have happened even more recently in the last, I don't know, 2 years or so, is you've seen the Directorate of Science and Technology and even the Directorate of Digital Innovation. They've been coming more into the fore into the construct of the mission centers than we previously had. Previously, there had been a lot more of kind of liaison, and they remained tethered as a director. But now we're seeing them really push people forward, particularly, for example, for the weapons analysis. You have more science and technology has moved into that mission center, also for the technology and transnational issues. So I think you're seeing even more synergy across multiple directorates now.
I would think, and correct me on this, but that with digital innovations, you'd also be getting more interaction with them on open source.
Absolutely. And that's within the Directorate of Digital Innovation is where the open source enterprise resides. Right. And so, yes, there's more of that interaction as well. People who are deployed into the mission centers to give their insight and use their open source tradecraft. So yes, you're absolutely seeing that.
You're raising so many interesting points. Let's talk a little bit about something you raised earlier. One of the things that I think was different and that changed perhaps, I would think about 20 years ago, was analysts having more opportunities to brief downtown, especially at the White House. And then you became a presidential briefer yourself. Can you speak a little bit about this key activity of intelligence analysis?
Absolutely. So, when I talk about things that I think changed during my career, one of the things I think changed is the way in which we have a dialogue with our customers. Now, some of that came out of Iraq WMD issues, but I think that idea where a customer, where it becomes an iterative dialogue, that's not politicization. That's a good thing. That's about transparency, to my mind. But oftentimes what that meant was that it was easier for the policymaker to cut out all the middlemen and just say, I want to talk to the analyst. I want to talk to the expert. And then you could really have that dialogue about why do you think what you think, as I said earlier, which is key to analytic tradecraft. And so President Bush, for example, was George W. Bush. He was very big on having analysts come down and doing what we used to call deep dives. And he would want to be able to question the person right there. He talks about that he likes to use the Socratic method. I'm not sure that's how it felt to all of us when he was peppering us with questions, but it made perfect sense to me that you just, let's get to the person. I can ask the question. I can really probe deep. I can find out why. So you had many analysts who got that opportunity, particularly during his administration, to talk directly to the president. But it happens with the NSC, it happens with Congress and others. It's not always easy, right? In part because when you are face to face with someone and you're telling them something they don't want to hear, they don't always take that graciously. There are times when there's a lot of pushback. And what I used to say to analysts was that I believe that pushback is in part the price for relevancy. And you don't take it personally. You have, you answer the questions, you explain why you think what you think, but you're not always going to get a policymaker to agree with you, right? That's not the job of an analyst. An analyst's job is at least at CIA, the analyst's job is to inform. It's not to be an advocate for a particular policy. It's not to try and change someone's mind. It's to inform them so that they can make decisions. And you also have to accept that you're not their only source of information. President Bush, for example, not only would speak to analysts, but he'd bring in authors of books. He would, of course, speak to foreign officials and others. So you had a lot of different inputs coming into the policy process. I also used to say that where you start with an administration, our interactions with them is kind of like a 4 to 8 year conversation. And it may start in one place where you're helping to level the playing field, help them understand what happened while their party wasn't in power, perhaps. But by the end of their term or terms, they have so much more experience where they're going to be looking at you saying, yes, but Putin told me, or what about this? And, so there's a whole lot more of a dialogue that goes on.
Let's talk a little bit more about the briefing, because I think our audience will find this fascinating.
Yeah.
So what was a typical day like for you getting ready for a job like that? And the type of things that you had to be ready for and prepare for, and what I know, of course, the answers, but I think it would be nice to hear what your experience was with it.
So a typical day, I guess what I'll say is a typical day was exhausting. But it was also one of the best jobs I ever had. I used to get up at 12:01 on Wednesday morning, if you would, because that way I could trick myself into saying it was Wednesday morning. And I'd get up at 12:01, I'd get into work by about 1:30 or so. And then it was about 6 or so hours of almost, think about it like prepping for finals every night. As the briefer, you're not the expert. You are representing the work of others across the community. And that's a real honor, but it's also kind of a heavy burden. So what you hopefully have been able to do is to understand your customer and the kinds of issues that they're dealing with and the kinds of questions they're likely to ask, so that you can think about presenting the information to the president with why are we using your time to tell you this? Why did the analyst think this was important enough that we were going to use valuable real estate on his calendar to tell him? And by the way, I always knew how busy that a president was, but it never really sunk in until I realized that, for example, President Bush's calendar was booked in 5-minute increments. So the fact that he spent basically 45 minutes or so, 6 days a week, no matter where he was, interacting with intelligence, that was a lot of valuable calendar real estate. And we had to make sure we were earning that every day. So I prepped for finals. I would try and anticipate the kinds of questions he would ask, maybe that first or second order, so that I could keep him, if you will, focused on the expertise of the piece, rather than particularly if it was something that was telling a story that was not necessarily something that he wanted to hear. This policy isn't going well, things aren't going well in Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever it might have been. Rather than it's easy, as I said, for someone to want to turn the page. But if you can say, no, wait, sir, here's why they're telling you this, or if he had a question, to be able to answer that. So like I said, prepping for finals. We traveled with him. As I said, that was the first president where that happened, that we were, as I said, wherever he was, 6 days a week. And he was a very discerning customer. I think that's another thing that I learned from having been a briefer, is that almost every president has both a public and a private persona. And you can't always believe everything that you hear in the news about people. I can tell you from personal experience that every president, from Reagan to Biden, made the time to interact with intelligence. And I had 2 metrics that I always used to see how we were doing administration. The first was did they make time? As I said earlier, time was one of their most valuable commodities. The second was, did they ask questions? Because if they didn't ask the intelligence community questions, they didn't have to, but the fact that they did meant that they cared what we thought. And again, every president asked that question, or asked the intelligence community question. They wanted to know what the analysts thought, to prevent surprise, to help reduce uncertainty on things, to maybe talk about unintended consequences. They said each and every one of them did that, no matter what you've heard in the press. Now, they all interact differently. And for each presidential briefer, we all had different experiences with administrations. Some presidents preferred to, like President Bush, preferred to read with the briefer there and ask the questions immediately. And he also preferred to have members of his national security team present at the briefings when we were in Washington. So, the vice president, the national security advisor, the chief of staff, they were all there. Other presidents prefer to read by themselves and ask questions later. Some presidents preferred to read it on an iPad, and some wanted it in hard copy, paper. It's also really important to make sure that you understand as a briefer, how your customer takes in information, right? Some people are visual learners. Some people are auditory learners. As I said, some like to really ask questions and push and probe right then and there. Some want to be more contemplative about it. President Bush was a little bit of all of those. He was a very visual learner. I think that people forget that he has an MBA, and so he can take a look at a graph, a chart, a map, whatever it might be, take in information quickly. One of my early briefings, I remember I went in and and this is going to sound stupid, but I'd been staring at a pie chart in the evening, that as I was prepping my material, trying to figure out what exactly am I trying to tell him? Are we trying to tell him with this pie chart? Like, what's the tee up, if you will, language I was going to use to say, sir, it's really important that this part of the pie. And so I had all these kinds of insightful things to say about a pie chart. And I walked in, and within about 30 seconds, he looked at me and he said, why doesn't it add up to 100? And I'd be like, damn, I hadn't even seen that, because it's a mistake, right? And you have to own up to your mistakes. Right. It's part of building trust with people. And so you can bet after that, every night I was there with a calculator, anytime there was something like that. But
it's happened to all of us once.
Yes.
It's happened all of us once, and then hopefully only once.
Oh, hopefully only once.
You're scared straight, about pie charts. Yeah.
Pie charts, or about, maps, or about whatever it might be. So he was both a visual learner, as I said, and he liked to right then and there ask questions of people. I've told this story before, but I'll tell a quick version of it. He wanted to be able to be himself, right? And to make sure that, so again, that developing a relationship as part of a briefer with your customer is really important. So when I became his briefer, the only question that he asked he didn't care who I voted for. It wasn't anything like that. He asked my predecessor about whether I could, quote unquote, take the heat. And by that, I think what he meant was, could he press me hard on questions? Could he, and was I going to take offense at that? And she assured him that yes, I could. But despite that assurance, very early on in my tenure, I think there was a test that was given, if you will. So it was my first time I was actually going to brief him. And my predecessor was still there. We were sharing the briefing duties for a couple of days so I could learn the ropes. And his aide walked in, we were down in Texas, and his aide walked in carrying this box, and he said something about it being toys for Barney the dog. And I was like, whatever, dude, I'm about to brief the president of the United States. My head was down. I was really focused on what I was doing. After the briefing was over, and the aide didn't get to stay in the room for the briefing, so he was outside, but the door opens up and he can now see in. And the president asked me if I would get something out of the box. And I was like, okay, you mean the toys for Barney? Sure. So I go and I open the box, and it was rigged to have a fake snake jump out. And, President Bush was a big practical joker, ran in his family. And now I'm not a jumpy person. And so, at least in my mind, my recollection of this is I said something witty. I looked at him, I closed the box, and I said, sir, I think Barney already got this one. And he didn't say a word. He just kind of smirked. He got up and he walked out. And his aide though came back in and he asked me, "What do you have, like ice in your veins?" And I said at the time, "No, I have an 8-year-old, and you're going to have to do a lot better." So again, being peppered, asked questions, those kinds of things. So
in that part of Texas, they could have done, they could have had their pick of a lot of real snakes.
Real snakes, that's true.
Yeah,
could have been worse.
Absolutely. Okay, I have one more question. Then I'd like to invite our audience and to ask questions, and please put them in the Q&A in the chat. Some of you have been doing it already. But last thing I'll ask formally here, maybe there'll be a few more, is with these changes that you've been seeing, especially in your leadership role in the Directorate of Analysis, and the technological changes that have been taking place at a rapid pace, what skill set are we looking for in future analysts now? Has it changed any in your mind, or is there something that, for example, young people out there should be thinking about getting smarter on if they would like a career as an intelligence analyst?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. I mean, I think the fundamentals of analysis haven't changed. So you need folks who think critically, who are inquisitive, who are good team players, who have a sense of humility, because as we talked earlier, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to be wrong. And the only way not to do that is to not make a call, and that's not helpful to anybody. You need people who are open-minded, who are willing to listen to different points of views, who can acknowledge their own biases. So all of those are the kinds of things that I think we've always needed in analysis. You need good people who can do good research. As I said, writing and briefing, all of that is important. I do think that some of the ways in which we deliver information is changing. So again, I think there's probably a much greater need for digital acumen than folks may have had in the past, because technology is changing so rapidly. So a comfort with that kind of technology. AI, I don't see AI as replacing analysts, but I do see AI as a tool for analysts. And so I think the more that young people can come in with a sense of comfort in digital acumen, a sense of agility, I think that's going to be important. I think I always used to tell analysts that there were really 3 parts to their career development, and I think this is still true. The first is about your substantive expertise. So whatever field folks who are watching today want to get into, whether it may be the Middle East or terrorism or weapons or Europe, whatever it might be, you're nurturing and developing a substantive expertise. Latin America, like yourself, right? There's a second side of this, which is nurturing and developing your skills as an intelligence officer. So the more folks can learn even before they come in about the intelligence cycle, about how you would drive collection, about who all the collectors are and the differences, I think all of that is really important. And then the third is, so you've got your substantive expertise, you've got your intelligence officer expertise, and then you've got what I used to call like a discipline expertise, right? So the analysts who come in, you're an economist, you're a political analyst, a leadership analyst, a military analyst. You're going to need to develop that as well. And one of the ways that the agency maintains its agility is at times I may call on you to emphasize more any one of those 3 legs of the stool. So maybe if you're a military analyst, but you work on Latin America, I may say to you, I need you to go work on the task force on Ukraine. And you're going to bring your skills and knowledge of military analysis with you rather than a knowledge of the region. Or you're going to bring your skills as an intelligence analyst to know how to interact and drive collection and talk to others and kinds of things. So I think the more people can kind of also keep abreast of what's happening in all parts of the world, you don't have to become an expert in it, but you have some working knowledge of what's going on. I think that's important for people. And then last thing I'm going to say, which is increasingly hard, and it's something I worry about, is this open-mindedness. And I think it can start in our schools. This idea that you have open and honest dialogue and can still go out with people for a cup of coffee or a beer afterwards, because you need to kind of thicken your skin a bit, not take everything personally. And if I'm going to challenge you on your analysis, that doesn't mean I'm challenging you as a person. And I think we need to make sure that we're helping people think that way, so that people don't become afraid to challenge ideas.
Thanks for the last point, especially because one of the things that I try, at least from my point of view, I try to convey to people is they talk about analysts as being, well, there's a lot of groupthink, right? And like, no, in fact, it's quite an argumentative environment.
It is.
And that's quite, I find it hard to believe that people think that, because most of the time, we're battling to the end on certain analytic topics, and that we can still have that cup of coffee or have lunch in the cafeteria together is very important. And
it's very funny. I've seen a number of press stories where people in Congress in particular are trying to say, well, the analysts were told they had to do, or they were whatever it might be. And as I said early on, when we went to a mission center construct, there were a number of congressmen who were worried about, and senators who were worried about objectivity. And one point I was in a briefing and I said, have you met our analysts?
Yeah, right.
They're not pushovers. Right. So yeah.
Yeah, you have to like to argue. You have to like to do it based on facts, and you have to know when to fold up, I think.
Right.
Sometimes you got to move on, and you eventually the piece has to be written. Great. Let me get to a few questions and I'm going to try to get as many as we can.
Okay.
What do senior decision makers want and not want from intelligence analysis? Specifically, do they want just the facts?
Froze on me.
Pardon me? Did I get cut off?
You froze. Can you do that one more time?
Yes, I can. What do senior decision makers want and not want from intelligence analysis? Just the facts, or more judgments based on the evidence? Do they want predictions?
Okay, I'm going to make up some of this question because you were breaking it out. But if I heard you correctly, policymakers want predictions out of analysts. Do they want, or do they just want the facts, or what do they want? And I'm going to say a couple of things on that. One, like, analysis isn't repertorial. It's not just about here's what happened. Although there are times when the policymaker may call on the analyst to say, what do you think happened? A missile strike on a hospital in Gaza. And it would be the difference between an analyst and the pundits that you might see on TV is the analyst has to explain why they think what they think. They don't get to just assert it. Right. And so you would be basing that on, because here's what the shrapnel looked like, and that kind of a crater is made by this kind of a bomb, or whatever it might be. And they're in both inventories of both the Hamas and the Israelis. So you would have that kind of thing where sometimes it's the facts, if you will, but it's always about going beyond just that. It's about the implications. It's about the why is it important. It's about knowing the policy world and the decisions that they're undertaking, that you can explain why this is important as part of their deliberations. And your part, if I understood the question as well, do they want predictions from analysts? They may want predictions, but that's not the job of intelligence, right? You're not going to predict the election in a particular country, or the job is, I think I said earlier, it's about reducing uncertainty. It's about giving implications. It's about helping them, not making the world simple, but understandable. So you might be giving them a framework about it. Here's the most likely scenario to happen and why, but here are 2 or 3 other things that could happen. Here are the drivers. So that if you as a policymaker want to affect change, here are the places you can push. You got to remember, policymakers became policymakers because they want to change the world. So they're always looking not just for bad news, but looking for opportunities. And that is part of the job of intelligence analysts as well, is to help them understand what the drivers are and the levers they have to affect change should they want to do so.
And on that point, a lot of our students, especially if they have a military intelligence background, ask the question, what are you giving policy advice though? And that's the question that comes up to me a lot. Are we supposed to be telling them what to do from our intelligence?
No. As I said earlier, the job of an analyst is not to be a policy advocate.
Right.
So you're more looking for the policymaker to say, here's the goal I want to achieve. And then you might come back with analysis that says, okay, if you want X to happen, here are the levers you have to make that happen. Here are the most likely ways you can do it. If you pull this lever, it's probably going to have a greater effect than this other one. So you're giving them options on how they might affect the change they want to have happen. It's never the job of the CIA analyst to come in and say, hey, I really think you need to do X. It's about, if you want this thing to occur, here are ways you can make it happen.
One of our viewers asked about the Office of Net Assessments at the Pentagon. Did you have any interaction with them in your relationship in the DA?
Sure. Part of the intelligence community is not as, it's big, but it's not as big as you think it might be. And particularly when you're writing for the president, you are coordinating across the entire intelligence community. And whether it be folks in DIA who are working a particular topic, or whether it's the Office of Net Assessments, when you're trying to think a little bit more about issues that have a bit more of a U.S. nexus. I think one of the harder things, again, that when you talk about changes that have occurred over my career, increasingly policymakers want someone to be the one to make a call about the U.S. Because if you're trying to do comparative analysis, and how do you say something like the Chinese are X numbers of years ahead or behind us in, I don't know, hypersonics or whatever it might be, if someone hasn't made the call, where's the US on that? Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes this idea of blue forces is what it's called, analysis, like where is the US? That's a really hard thing, because the CIA is not looking at that. And you also don't want it to be necessarily, for example, DOD or others grading their own homework. So again, there's a lot of different ways that trying to work through that. And that particular office at the Pentagon was one we used to try and work with on that as well.
Thanks for that. Ian asked a question about, since keying on your being an early adapter of the internet, right? And how that changed the business of intelligence analysis. And how do you think it's continuing to change that, particularly with just the sheer volume of information, bad and good, mostly bad, that analysts have to deal with today? How does it shape the way we sort of focus our intelligence questions, for example?
So it's true. There was a period in my career where you might have also had this, Michael, where you could be looking at what, your material for the day, and you had it next doc and there wasn't one, right? You had read everything. You'd reached the end of the internet. Nowadays, when I say that, most times students look at me as if I have two heads, and they can't even imagine that you would ever get to a point where you would have read everything you needed to read for a day. And now it's really more about trying to find the right information and making sure that you aren't missing things in the oceans of information that are out there, which is why I have great hope that AI will help in that regard. We already have at CIA data scientists and others who are helping to really help structure information in a way that maybe make it so you won't miss information. But you're right about the idea, misinformation, disinformation, that's not a new phenomenon, but it's coming at us all as individuals, whether you're an analyst or just in society. It's coming at us at a rate that we never have seen before. And so I really think that what this requires then is that folks take a much more critical eye towards information. And again, I'm going to say that this is something I think needs to start much earlier in our education system. And I having retired, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone to talk a little bit about the US and what I think needs to happen, because that was never anything I would do previously. But the fact that there was a Pew poll about a year, maybe a little more or so ago, that said that US citizens between 18 to 29 years old were almost as likely to believe something that they had read on the internet as they were from a national news outlet. Mm-hmm. But yet there's no attempt to validate that information for most information on social media. So it's going to require that we teach folks to look at things critically. I realize that I don't read information the same way that others do. I am always looking for what's not there, for the disconfirming information. I go back to original sources. If a poll is cited somewhere in an article and I care enough, I actually go back and look at the poll, because very often the journalist has massaged it, characterized it in a way to fit the story they wanted to have. So we need to, as a society, be more discerning about our own, how we're taking in information. And then hopefully there'll be tools and other things that are going to be developed that'll help you ensure the provenance of something, and that, a photo hasn't been photoshopped or whatever it might be, those kinds of things. But it's changing, and it's going to get harder for folks to sort through and find the right information.
Well, getting back to your original point about, the analysts that we recruit, I mean, your list there, it's a lot of things people have to know to be, even to come in as a junior analyst. You have to have a lot of savvy on to begin with on the information you're dealing with. Let me get to a couple more questions. Frederick asks about, did the presidents have a clear understanding of what is and is not intelligence? What information they should get from an intelligence briefer, and what information should come from other agencies? Where intelligence ends and policy begins, and what could we do about that?
So every president comes in, particularly in the beginning, with a different understanding of that. And I think part of the role of intelligence, there is a bit of an education role. And maybe this is something quickly to just talk about as we are in an election year. Every president since President Truman has offered to the presidential candidates briefings from the very beginning to help them understand what are the key issues they might face. And he did that, as you know, Michael, I'm sure, because when he came into office, he had been kept in the dark on a lot of things. He didn't even know about the Manhattan Project. Mm-hmm. And so he decided he didn't want that to happen to anyone else, any other president and nuclear agent. So there are these kinds of briefings. But it also is incumbent throughout the term of a president for the intelligence community. We're very proactive, right? And oftentimes we get asked questions that maybe shouldn't be answered by the intelligence community. And you need to go back and say, sir, that would be better answered by, I don't know, the Department of Labor, or whomever. Or to help reframe the question in, well, here's the question that we would be able to answer as an intelligence question. As I said earlier, that there's a greater dialogue these days. Sometimes questions are asked in a way that are designed to get a response. It's not usually this blatant, but something like, tell me the 5 good things that would happen if we did X. Well, that's part of the intelligence community's job, is to come back with a complete answer. So you asked me about the 5 good things that would happen. I'm also going to tell you, here's all the, other consequences of what might happen. It's because it's actually I would have probably rephrased this and said, good is a subjective thing, right? So I can't tell you what good things are, but here are 5 things that would happen that would be probably go against your policy, and here are 5 things that would probably support your policy. But so you don't just take questions blindly, you help reframe them. And if you're not the right place to answer it, you go back and you say, we're not the right place, but here we'll try and get that to the right people to answer that question.
Let's ask a question about the work of the analysts themselves, especially from your reference point of heading the DA. Do you think that CIA analysts, let's say, overvalue human intelligence?
I don't know that I would say they overvalue it. And particularly nowadays when folks have greater understanding of sourcing than they have ever had. But I do think it's still really important for analysts to understand that human intelligence in many ways should be the intelligence of last resort, not the intelligence of first resort. And I do think that they may place too much emphasis because it's easier to say, well, I have questions. Let's see if we can find a source to answer this. And the reason I say it should be of last resort is human intelligence puts lives at risk, whether it be the CIA officers or the assets themselves. And we should reserve those for the hardest of the hard questions, the things that we can't find elsewhere, which particularly with as we've talked earlier about the oceans of open source data, we need to understand what's out there so that we're not asking someone to go risk their life for something that we could already find somewhere else. So I do think that perhaps not that they overvalue it, but it might be easier sometimes to turn to, hey, do we have a human source who can answer this question, rather than seeing if there's something else out there that we could use beforehand. So I think there's some of that. They may, because it may appear as though they overvalue and place greater emphasis on human sources, again, because they know more about the human sources than perhaps someone in another agency would. So if you really understand that, hey, the person who is saying this is a true nuclear expert, I'm probably going to put a little more weight in that than what the sourcing statement might just say, a scientist who, said something. So there may be a little bit of that as well that goes into folks thinking that CIA officers place greater emphasis on the human sources. But let me just say one other thing. This gets back to, critically evaluating. CIA officers have to understand what were the circumstances under which this was collected. You need to understand that maybe, analysts can dance on the head of a pin about, did he really say blue, or, was it periwinkle? Which one is it? Does it? And you need to know when it matters enough to go back and ask. But some of the other intelligence, if you will, that are out there, they're not, all of them need to be looked at critically. Some people like to think about that something that comes out of signals intelligence, well, that must be true because they didn't know we were listening. And whenever I hear that, I often joke and say, right, so you've never lied in a conversation to somebody, that guy may have been trying to brag to his mistress. And, so you can't, just because they didn't know you were listening doesn't mean that it's true. So everything has to be evaluated critically.
Can you speak a few minutes about the relationship between the analysts and the operators when you were in the center, working in the mission centers? Is that something has that improved? And when I say improved, I mean, is there greater interaction, cooperation, and probably I would think that would be an advance for the overall mission.
Yeah, so here's what I'll say. I think that I was always surprised how little other parts of the CIA really understood about what analysts do. And I do think that the creation of mission centers was an eye-opening moment for other directorates to really understand what an analyst does. Because oftentimes you had, the director of operations folks or others who are collecting secrets, and the analysts are the dangerous part, right? They collect all these secrets and then we actually want to tell them to people. And so the realizing that analysts are, as we said earlier, they're an argumentative bunch, and they're going to be folks that, they understand now more throughout the agency, the whole process, for example, of creating a PDB. I had very senior director of operations officers and director of science and technology officers who never understood that it was a 24/7 operation to create the president's daily brief. They just had never focused on it. And so again, I think that there's a whole lot more understanding throughout the agency of what each of us does and what our roles are in the process.
Early on, somebody asked a question about the president's daily brief, and I wanted to get to it. So selecting those, getting to the point where you're selecting those articles for the PDB. I mean, that's there's a lot of choices that get involved in that. And there was other times, I would think, when it was also a case where there was a lot of things to put in and then not too much.
Yeah.
How were those decisions made? We don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But
so the quick answer to this is that since the creation of the DNI, the DNI has taken ownership of the president's daily brief. CIA still produces the vast majority of the material that goes into it, but it's now a DNI responsibility to ultimately be the ones to say, here's what's going in to the president. Now, a lot more information gets produced than goes to just the president, and some material, the National Security Advisor is getting more information perhaps than the president is because it's being distilled down, and so there's many more customers than just the president for the president's daily brief. I think that's something to think about. But as I said, ultimately, you're right. There's more that needs to be fit into the book than you can do on any given day. When CIA does its planning meeting for how the pieces it's going to produce, and think about it like a newsroom, if you will, or a magazine. There's a daily meeting to be planning the kinds of things we think are important and we need to put in the book. It usually falls into kind of three categories is how I like to look at it. One are things that are based on what's on his calendar. So he's got a visit with somebody, he's traveling someplace, you've got something tied towards that. Second are kind of these enduring issues. You can bet that there's every day, I'm sure, something now on Russia, Ukraine, or on, Gaza. So enduring kinds of issues. And then I guess there are four categories. Then there are the kinds of things where the analysts have identified something that they really think the president needs to be focused on. So some new insight. And then the last one, though, I always called it making a policymaker eat their vegetables. Something really long-term that if they don't take action today during their term, 10 years from now, when they're no longer going to be in office, something bad will, or something, could be happening. And that's really hard because they only have so much calendar space and so much time to focus on. And so when you're trying to say, but I need you to pay attention to this really long-term thing, like think some weapon system that's being developed or whatever, that's hard. So it's usually every day, it's some mixture of those kinds of things that all get put into the book. So
thanks. Last question, and we're running a little bit short on time, but thanks for everybody. By the way, terrific questions and today. I'm really glad that you're so engaged, and we have such a great guest for us. Linda, what do you think? Language skills, something that comes up a lot, especially in intelligence education, and your own role as really head of education for the director of analysis and overseeing that. What do we need to do to keep staying relevant and getting people the language skills we need, both before they're coming into the agency and also while they're in the agency?
Absolutely. So language skills are always going to be a plus. So back to your question from the beginning of what are other things that young people can be doing, it's always going to be a plus. And it's not just for the language itself. As those of you who have learned languages know, it also helps you to understand culture. So I highly recommend folks to take languages. Maintaining a language is hard. And so I think that part of that as well, and the agency has worked really hard to try and figure out ways to have folks maintain language. So there's, monetary inducements for it, but I think it's also about making sure that it's relevant to your work. So the more that you can read in the vernacular, the more that you can go brief in a particular language, or overhear someone being, who you're talking to in the language, and engage with our liaison partners. All those are tremendous pluses, I think, that will help advance a career and help you to be a better analyst. So I would absolutely encourage folks to get a language and then work to maintain it. And nowadays, you can listen to podcasts in foreign languages. You can read a whole lot of material stuff, but once you get it, don't lose it, because it's always so hard to get it back.
Much better resources at our disposal now to learn languages than ever before. That's a wonderful thing. We'd like to thank Linda Weissgold for being with us today. It was a great talk. Thanks for being such a good and patient guest. Sorry about the internet connections, everybody. I worked on it since 5 this morning and still working on it. I would like to mention to you that we will be having another Inside Intelligence coming up next month. Keep an eye out for Dr. Robert Clark, one of our faculty members, who will be talking about intelligence to monitor and hopefully contain weapons of mass destruction. So that'll be coming up later in June. And if a few of you wanted to reach out to me about various programs and engagement, please, you can email me at mard@jhu.edu. So I hope we'll be in touch. And I thank you again, Linda, for being with us, and we hope you can be a guest for us again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.